one of the major issues that I have with the majority of TOEIC materials on the market is they're based upon the idea that you learn to do something by doing it. For example, if you want to learn to play tennis, the idea is you get out on the tennis court and you hit ball after ball after ball, and eventually you do it. Yeah. The idea, by extension with the TOEIC, is that most textbooks seem to have the idea that if we want to learn to do the TOEIC, you just do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions. And basically how this translates in the classroom is they do 30 or 40 questions, and then the teacher goes through and analyzes their mistakes. Specifically, mainly in most cases, they're grammar mistakes. Now the problem with this is that it misses out on a huge part of what I think is being tested on the TOEIC. It doesn't focus on things like the listening and reading skills that are essential. Yeah? Basically, it's a listening and reading test, so you need to work on these skills. You need to work on things like skimming and scanning so they can read through the passages quickly. You need to work on underlying listening skills like prediction and basically being able to understand paraphrasing and things like that. Just doing lots and lots of practice, you may be able to pick out some of these things somehow by osmosis, but without these key elements of the listening skills and the reading skills, and especially test-taking strategies, which are dealt with in most materials on the market, but in a fairly perfunctory way. Yeah? I think there's a lot of underlying stuff that I think needs to be addressed that most current course books don't address. Basically, for low-level students, it would seem to almost be a no-brainer that those would be an obvious choice. The main reason being is that the TOEIC, even though it's aimed to be accessible for a range from very low-level ability to very high, unless you're about a good pre-intermediate, the majority of the test is going to be very, very difficult. So for lower-level students, ideally we'd like to use practice materials that are at the level of the test. But for lower level students, they just find it too difficult, especially if you're doing nothing but practice activities. Yeah? Because what you find is that you do 30 questions and the students can't understand more than half of them. It's very demotivating, very frustrating, and basically doesn't get very good results either. So basically all those, target 550, 450 for the TOEIC, what those materials do is they simplify the actual materials they present the students with. They use simplified vocabulary, they use shorter reading and listening passages, they limit the amount of grammatical structures the students see, and this makes it much easier for the students to actually approach these kind of tests. And so basically for many years I used these kind of materials, and in fact the students have a much easier time going with it. For teachers, of course, it's much, much easier to run these kind of classes. Students don't struggle. Basically it seems to make kind of intuitive sense for teachers that you try to choose the materials you're using in the class to match the level of your students. All in all, it would seem to be a win-win basis, except for one thing, and that's when the students go to take the real test, they find that the real test in no way resembles what they've been practicing with for the last few months. And what I've actually come to believe is that these simplified materials do more harm than good for these students. Not only do students not make any significant gains, but in terms of the frustration factor, it becomes almost a shock. I've had students come back to me and say, teacher, I studied for 3 months in your course, but my score went down by 15 points. You're a bad teacher. I can understand totally. What am I supposed to say in a situation like that? It's frustrating for them. It's shocking for the teacher when they've actually learned a lot. But in terms of actually preparing them for the nature of the challenge they're going to face, you've actually failed them. So I can't do it anymore. Basically what it came down to, for many years I was asked to write materials of that nature for low-level students, and I constantly said, no, I'm not doing it. Basically, by using these materials, you're shooting your students in the foot. You're giving them this placebo effect, but in fact, you're not helping them at all. All you're doing is taking their money, wasting their time, and basically not giving them good value in return. The thing that changed my mind is that finally it came to my attention that the TOEIC is broken down into roughly about 3 equal parts in terms of difficulty. 1/3 of the test items are aimed at lower level students. 1/3 are aimed at the intermediate range. 1/3 are aimed at the higher level range. So it occurred to me that in class, rather than simplifying the materials unnaturally, what we could do is we could basically, in each unit, we could start off and present them with materials that could actually appear on a real TOEIC test, but would be on the easier end of the range in the early parts of the unit. You have to expose them to material that's on the actual test, or else when they face it on test day, they're going to shut down. But in order to do this, you have to take a systematic build-up approach and work on those underlying skills, the vocabulary, any sort of grammatical features, test-taking strategies, the listening and reading skills necessary to approach that. If you build up that sound basis, then you can expose them to the level they're going to face on the test, and they have a decent chance of doing it. Otherwise, it's going to be meltdown on test day.